In line with the United Nations International Decade for People of African Descent, Epatiy, the International Decade for People of African Descent Assembly, was launched in 2018 with a mission to champion recognition, justice, and development of people of African descent. However, just 4 years after its inception, the organization faced a major setback when government funding was suspended amidst allegations of political bias, allegations it rejected as false. Now, the program enters its second decade. Epatiy has vowed to redouble its efforts against discrimination, marginalization, and oppression of people of African descent. On today's episode of Sources, we'll sit down with Mr. Vincent Alexander, the chairman of Epatiy, as we discuss the organization's journey and how it plans to treat with the challenges that lie ahead. Hello, good evening, and welcome to Sources. I'm your host, Svetlana Marshall. Tonight, we'll take a look at Epatiy, and to do so with me, I have the chairman, Mr. Vincent Alexander. Mr. Alexander, welcome to our program.
Thank you very much for having me.
Mr. Alexander, in the United Nations designated 2015 to 2024 as the International Decade for People of African Descent under the theme Recognition, Justice, and Development. Looking back since Epatiy was established, do you think the organization was able to achieve much of the objectives set out by the UN?
Well, actually, the UN's objective was for recognition, justice, and development of the people of African descent. I think that the very presence of Epatiy has contributed to the first of those objectives, recognition. I think the issues relating to the people of African descent are far more on the front burner at this time than they were prior to the decade. And I think, as I said, Epatiy's presence has contributed to that. I think we are still a far cry from justice and development. And let me contextualize that. What the UN said specifically is that there are remnants of the period of slavery and post-slavery and colonization in terms of institutional arrangements and legal arrangements which still pertain and have affected, are affecting the lives of people of African descent. And so what we need is institutional and legal reform along with equity to bring about some kind of equalization in that context. Those things to a very large extent relies on the state. Those things rely on the state. When you talk about institutional arrangements, when you talk about legal reform, it's the state. And so what Epatiy, in fact, was preparing itself to do was advocacy in relation to institutional and legal matters. It's exactly at that point where we were prepared and we approached the government by writing to the president to engage them that the relationship went sour. And so not very much has happened in that regard. Not very much has happened in that regard in terms of what we wanted to advocate for.
Now, before the relationship went sour in 2022, what were some of the things Epatiy did on the ground? What were some of the things it advocated for? What were some of the initiatives that it was able to carry out?
Much of our work at that time was the mobilization of the people themselves. And so what Epatiy did was to hold a number of conferences across the country, not typical conferences, empowerment conferences, where we invited the community and we took to them information that would empower them. So for example, we invited agencies like the Guyana Marketing Corporation, like the banks, like the people for births and deaths, registration of business, so that the people could have information that they can then use to enhance their own lives and to seek opportunities. So that's a part of what what we did. Mobilizing the people, sharing with them, seeking to empower them. We had a fairly powerful youth committee that also engaged in activities. And so, for example, we had statutory activities such as our business forum, where we sought to encourage young people who are involved in business to come and do business pitches to the public with their goods, and we gave them prizes. We did this more than once. We also had another activity where, again, we brought in young people who were involved in business and gave them prizes based on the pitch of what they did. So we were encouraging young people to get involved in business, and in these activities we also did training with them. Training in marketing, training in packaging and things like that, training in advertising. The young people also had a program called Split the Press, I think it was. And in that program, which was an online program, a number of issues were addressed by people competent in those areas. Again, informational empowerment. We also sought, where possible, to give small grants to organizations for them to be involved in their own activities at home, in the villages. And we as well had more than one exhibition of vendors. We brought in vendors. It was held in Main Street, it was held at Coffee Square, to exhibit their goods, crafts, products, etc. And with those vendors, we also did sessions with them in relation to packaging, in relation to advertisement, in relation to marketing of their produce. So all of this was intended at the empowerment of these vendors and overcoming the problems that confronted people of African descent in terms of entrepreneurship. We also had a very important session with teachers. We brought in Professor Shepherd, who is at the UN level in the human rights body and at the University of the West Indies, to have a session with our teachers on the question of Guyanese history and the importance of history. Because one of the things we were aiming at was introduction of history in our school system, real Guyanese history. So we had I think about over 100 teachers came in, and we dealt with them through Ms. Shepherd on the question of history as well. So there's quite a bit of work that we were doing, but I would still contend that the core really should have been, how do we dismantle these institutions or reform the institutions that impact the lives of people of African descent, as well as legal reform. Now, you know, very often people will raise questions, what do you mean by institutional reform?
And I was about to ask that.
And what you mean by legal reform?
And what you were exactly going to lobby government to do.
Beautiful, beautiful. So let me give an examples first. Let's take, for example, the police force.
Yeah.
That's an institution. Now that police force, when it was first founded, it was founded really to control, repress, largely the people of African descent. It was founded just after abolition, and the intent was to control the people of African descent. The ethos of the police force hasn't quite changed. And we see this up to yesterday, the way in which they deal with situations. Here is somebody accused of something, and the first thing they do is go running behind the person and shooting at the person. Now, institutional change in that regard would be the police operating in a different way. Police being not a force, but a service. And so that's an example of an institution, and there are many other institutions that are in that same old mode. Let me give you another example in terms of legal change. You may or may not know that you have prescriptive rights, which allows for somebody's land to be taken away if someone else comes and occupies the land for a certain period and the original owner does not take action or object, that person can be granted the land. If you look to Guyana, a lot of African Guyanese have lost their lands through prescriptive rights to others. So that's a legal arrangement. I think the government recognized the problem. And the government, having recognized the problem, actually legislated to change the law so that prescriptive title cannot be granted to state lands. So here are lands that belong to us as Guyanese. And if you occupy those lands for an extended period without anybody saying anything to you, the government has now passed a law saying, no, you can't get that land as yours. But they have not similarly passed the law to protect the people and their private property in that regard. And the most affected are people of African descent. So here's an example of an institution that, a legal arrangement that needs to be changed. So that in our preparation for advocacy, and we spent about a year and a half preparing for advocacy, we brought in professional and technical people, and the areas we were looking at, we would have looked at health. Has the state in its programming in the health sector done sufficient work in terms of understanding the state of the health of the people of African descent? The way in which historically things would have occurred that impact the health of people of African descent, and the way in which it can now be addressed. You know, very often you hear issues like people of African descent are more affected than anyone else in terms of blood pressure and diabetes. And these things sometimes have to do with our diet, a diet which we inherited from the period of slavery. So that's a kind of institutional arrangement as well. Has the state reviewed those things so that the people of African descent can get the best of education, the best of service in terms of health? So that's another area. So I talked about the police force. Here I'm talking now about health. The other areas, education. Does our education system really provide for the proper recognition of the people of African descent? Does it really say what the history is of these people, what contribution they've made to Guyana, and by virtue of that, imbuing them a sense of self? So that's another area we were advocating for. And actually in that area, we did in fact write to the government, the ministry, seeking to meet with them to discuss the introduction of history, proper history, where Guyanese history in depth is taught to the people at large, but ensuring that the contribution of people of African descent is not omitted in that regard. We also spoke to the University of Guyana to say to them, you have an Amerindian Studies unit. You probably need an Ethnic Studies unit. And in that Ethnic Studies unit, you can also have a subsection that deals with African studies, the way in which you're presently dealing with Amerindian studies, so that that unit and its studies can bring to bear the issues that confront the people of African descent to inform policy. Because when you talk about advocating for institutional and legal change, what you're really talking for is policies that will address these issues.
And so you're saying, as a result of the fallout in 2022, a lot of what IDPADA-G had planned, it wasn't able to execute with regards to lobbying government for institutional change. Now, let's talk about that fallout. Now, in 2022, in the latter part of 2022, or mid, the government accused IDPADA-G of being a political organization, in other words. But apart from that, it spoke to the way the organization was administering its funds, saying that a large percentage of the funds allocated through subventions, government subventions, was utilized for administrative purposes, and the money was not really getting to the people. How do you respond to that allegation? It was said by the government minister, in fact, that IDPADA-G was not supporting the development of people of African descent and their communities.
Let me start off by saying this. It was never the intention that the IDPADA-G would be a grant organization. We know the state of the people of African descent, and therefore there would have been the expectation of those people that once money is around, they'd get grants. But it was never intended to be a grant organization. It's the first point we want to make. The second point we want to make is that we established a secretariat. It is that secretariat that was driving the program of the IDPADA-G. If we did empowerment exercises like the ones I mentioned earlier, work with the youth, work with the vendors, work with the teachers, the administration of those things requires money. So to say that the people didn't benefit from the money is false, because the programs that the Secretariat enabled were programs that delivered to the people. So whilst they might not have been a delivery of cash, grants in that regard, there was a delivery to the people in the effort to empower them, to make them more knowledgeable, to make them more capable. And so we were in fact addressing the state of the people of African descent by that delivery. That notwithstanding, we did get from the government in 2018 $10 million for grants. That's the only time we got money for grants. And let me say that we didn't simply get a subvention. We submitted a budget. And so the government was quite aware of what our budget provided for. And so it's highly hypocritical of a government, after granting us a subvention, approving on an approved budget, to come back and say we were not doing with the money what was intended, when in fact what was intended was clearly spelled out in our budget, a budget which they responded to and which they funded. So there's a lot of hypocrisy in what the government said about us and the manner in which our money was spent. And they went beyond that simple hypocrisy. They sought to accuse individuals of making personal use of the money, and that's one of the matters that is in court. The fact of the matter is that the IDPADA-G's coordinating council were essentially volunteers who got no financial returns whatsoever from IDPADA-G and its subvention. But as I was saying, we did at one time get $10 million in 2018 specifically for grants. That was outside of the subvention. Now that came in 2018 around December. We disbursed that in 2019 with a residual sum of $300,000 that went over to 2020. What did Vice President Jagdeo do? We gave them all of our documents. We had nothing to hide. They sent for our documents, we gave them. This guy dishonestly took those documents, looked at 2020, saw the disbursement of the residual sum of $300,000 and told the world that all we gave our people was $300,000 in grants. But in fact, in 2019, we had disbursed from the 10 million, and all that remained in 2020, he described. So on one hand, we weren't intended to give grants. On the other hand, even in the instance where we gave grants, there's a tremendous misrepresentation, a distortion by the government as to what in fact had been given out as grants. Now, the government sent a team from the Ministry of Finance, from a unit called some investigative unit, to do an investigative audit of IDPADA-G. They came, they audited. I think this audit was done in 2022. They went back to the ministry, they sent them back in 2023 to probe. They could find nothing to call IDPADA-G to boards. We were above board in terms of their audit, as much as we were above board in terms of our own audit, which we were required to do as a not-for-profit company. But you know what? It came to our attention And when those auditors were sent, that they were given specific instructions to probe, to see if individuals like myself, and in fact my name was called, could be fingered in terms of the handling of the funds of Epatiy-G. They could not find anything. But this dishonest and vicious and vindictive approach to Epatiy-G has continued. And you know, interestingly, I was in a program a few nights ago, and the question of Epatiy-G came up. And we raised some of these issues, and eventually the person who is a government official said, well, the problem might have been that they might have been the wrong political flavor. So an admission that all of this had to do with what they claimed to be a political bias of Epatiy-G. But the fact of the matter is that Epatiy-G, in its earlier years, never went public in anything about government. In fact, what we sought to do was to have a conversation with government. And the moment they chose to start to attack Epatiy-G was Coffee 250's conference, the emerging apartheid regime. Epatiy-G was not in Epatiy-G's conference, it's a Coffee 250 conference. I was scheduled to speak, and so was Dr. Nikki Kwee. They didn't wait to hear what I would say. In fact, in my presentation, I did not come to the conclusion that we had an apartheid state. I said definitionally we could not call Guyana an apartheid state, though I said that there were elements of concern for the people of African descent. So here they're accusing us of something with which we are not in any way associated, and I'm not questioning whether the thing is valid or not. That's not the question. The question is the false accusation and using that. Because what VP Jagdeo said, that we were biting the hands that were feeding us. Feeding us. A subvention from government, the money of the people given to us. Whose hands are we biting? Our own hands then. Because this is not money from Jagdeo. So you see the tendency of the government to behave as if they're doing some favor. The assets of the people of Guyana belong to them rather than to the people, them being mere custodians and administrators of those funds.
Mr. Alexander, you said that Epatiy-G is primarily an organization to advocate, an advocacy body, and it was never really the intention to disperse funds in the form of grants. But you did. Yes. You did in 2018, you did in 2019. What sparked the need to solicit that $10 million from the government? And looking back on following the fallout, there were organizations, Afro-Guyanese organizations, who indeed said, yes, we probably needed the funds. Looking back, do you think that going forward, if government is to heed to your request for funding again, would you maybe include in that sum money to allow for the distribution of grants? Because some people may argue that while we have the knowledge, if we don't have the financial resources to execute our plans, they may not be able to implement a lot of what was taught.
We did the grant arrangement in response to the people of African descent. So though that was not what I consider the core activity, you have to be responsive to your constituency. It's because of that responsiveness that we did the grant arrangement. Because separate and apart from the 10 million which I referred to, we also took a decision and started giving annual small grants to each organization at emancipation time. So we did that as well. Grants, I would say, are important, but it has to go hand in hand with our core activity. Why? Because what we wanted through institutional change and legal change is to enable people to do things, some of which, even if they have the financial resources, cannot be easily done if they don't have the institutional and legal environment in which to do it. So these things go hand in hand. And so it's not a chicken and an egg situation, because the empowerment, in a sense, comes first. But given the state of the people and their own expectations, then strategically you have to give some grants along the way as you get to the point of creating the environment where, when grants are given, they really impact the lives of the people of African descent. Let me give you an example. I have to call the Minister of Agriculture. We, subsequent to the subvention being withdrawn, were able to get some money for grants. And so we presently have 19 organizations that are beneficiaries. 19 that are beneficiaries of those grants. And I got a complaint from one of the organizations recently, they're into agriculture, that they are not getting the attention from NARI and from the Guyana School of Agriculture that they need if the projects are to be successful. Here again is the question of institutional arrangements. And this is not a tomorrow story, this is a today's story. It's happening right now. I'm not going to call the organization's name. They got a grant from us, they're into agriculture, they're having some problems with pests and things like that requires help from NARI. They're not getting the help. But there's evidence of people in the same area who are getting that kind of help. So you see the importance of institutional arrangements being different in this country, so the people of African descent can benefit. We saw the problem with institutional arrangements during the flood, where lots of people of African descent were not contacted for flood relief. And we at IDPADA-G actually spent $4 million from Crabwood Creek to the Pomeroon, enumerating people who had been skipped in the flood relief exercise. And we took those names, and Minister Mustafa was cooperative. So we took those names to him and said to him, here people, your people have left out. Could you deal with them? And he promised to do that. You know, subsequently what Jack Dio said? That what we did was political work, is the work of the PNC. That's what he said, ridiculous. But here again, it demonstrated institutional arrangements are not in place, they're not working the way they should work. We're thankful that the minister in that instance was responsive. And I hope when I approach him shortly about the people who are affected, he'll be responsive. But the fact of the matter is, we shouldn't have to be making these approaches. The institutions should simply work for the people.
Mr. Alexander, at the time the subvention was cut, government withdrew those subvention. Was it how much money the organization was receiving from government? I know that you were in the red about $10 million owed at the time as a result of the subvention being terminated. What's your accounts looking like? How much money owed? I know you had to downsize the operation, but what was the impact?
Well, first of all, the subvention was $100 million per year. That was the subvention. Whether that's big money or not is another question. 100 million. We had to downsize our staff. If we had a staff of about 12 to 14, we came down to a staff of about 4. Right? When we got the project I just referred to, we recruited 2 people specifically for that project. So we had to significantly downsize, and much of the money that we owe, in fact, would be to staff, because with the sudden cut in at the end of August, we retained the staff for another, contractually we had to, and so we are indebted to the staff. We were doing at the same time an exercise, a survey across this country about the needs of the people of African descent, the needs, a needs survey we were doing. Many of those enumerators are still to be paid because it affected them. It affected them as well.
Now you would have, Epatiy in fact, would have taken the matter to the court. Any updates? How is that case going?
Well, that case was heard to completion. It's now approximately 2 years. and there's been no judgment. Apparently, the court doesn't consider Epatiy-G a matter of urgency. And I say that because there are many other cases in the same court that were filed after that have been heard. Now, one may argue that they're constitutional cases and therefore those have to get priority, and that's fine. But there are other cases. I've heard defamation of character cases and all of that have been filed after Epatiy-G's case. They've been heard and judgments handed down. Epatiy-G's case came to a conclusion in terms of the hearing about 2 years ago, and we haven't heard a single word about the judgment.
But how have you been able to execute? I know that we're now in a second decade recognizing the people of African descent. How are you able to execute your mandate in the absence of the funding, in the absence of the ruling? I know you've mentioned that you would have gotten some amount of grants, but is that sufficient to carry the organization?
It's not sufficient for us to do all that we are supposed to be doing. It's not. But I must say that we have been able to keep our doors open because there are private individuals who have been making donations, because we have a lot of volunteer work is also being done. For example, our CEO, who was previously a paid officer, has completely volunteered and continues to work as our CEO, absolutely no remuneration. And that's not, it's a senior office, payment of some substantial sum. She's working free. And there are others who are working free. Those of us who are in the coordinating council are ourselves making contributions, material and financial contributions, in addition to the other contributions. There's some people overseas who are also making some contributions. And so with those contributions, we've been able to keep our doors open.
Okay, now that there is a second decade that is being observed, Epatiy-G has vowed to redouble its efforts in the struggle against discrimination, marginalization, and oppression of people of African descent during this decade. What is the organization plan of action to achieve all that?
Well, first of all, we are continuing the effort of fundraising so that we have resources at our disposal. Secondly, we are looking more and more to source grant funds so that through those grant funds we can reach out to our organizations. There are some grant funds that can also come to the Secretariat for the kind of advocacy and the kind of educational program that we wish to do, so that we are focusing on how we can reach out to those sources of funding. For the last year of the last decade, we had in place a team, again of volunteers, but people who are professionals and experts, working on what we call a way forward document. So we do have a plan for the way forward. That plan has not yet been blessed by the Assembly because it has to be blessed at a general meeting, which we plan to hold shortly. Only recently we had cluster meetings, Essequibo, West Demerara, Region 4, Region 5, and Region 6. We had cluster meetings, meaning we went and we met with our membership. We shared with them the thoughts that have been developed in relation to the way forward, and we asked them to make contributions towards that. And so we're now finalizing that way forward plan, and that will be unfolded at our AGM. And I think that would be the most appropriate time for us to see exactly what we're going to be doing, because then we'll have the blessing of our membership.
Given the challenges that Epatiy-G has experienced with regards to funding, in April 2024, it made a call to the United Nations to have funding channeled through that international body to country organizations. Could you say if the UN would have yielded to that recommendation?
Epatiy-G was not singular in its call. At that forum, by and large, most of the organizations representing the people of African descent across the globe made that call. I cannot say that we have gotten a financial response to that call, but what I can say is if one looks at the permanent forum to be held starting the 14th of this month, one of the issues that again is on the agenda is what kind of material assistance can be had. And I think what is being suggested is not just that the UN will try to give resources. The UN really doesn't hand out lots of resources. But for the UN to work with other agencies which have the mandate to give resources, for them to give resources that are specified for the decade and for organizations. But we cannot lose sight of the fact that the UN has clearly also identified the state as having a responsibility. And unfortunately, our state has reneged or is reneging on that responsibility. They've even reneged on what they promised. When they stopped the funding of Epatiy-G, they said they would give organizations funds directly. They did that in 2023. Not a cent of that sort was given in 2024, and I don't know of the budgetary provision in 2025. But we've got to press on, both in terms of working with the others globally for funding from funding agencies, as well as getting the UN to press on government to make funds available.
Now, the Epatiy-G would be among organizations attending the UN Permanent Forum for People of African Descent, and this forum is going to take place next week. What are some of the primary issues the organization intends to raise at that forum?
Well, first of all, the forum itself is the new decade continues to look at the question of recognition, justice, and development. The forum itself is focusing on reparations and has a number of sub-themes. The sub-themes that they're looking at would be human rights. That's one. They're looking specifically at Haiti. That's two. There are 5 sub-themes that they're looking at. And what we propose to do is to make presentations under those sub-themes. So we'll be making a presentation on the human rights. There's a general presentation that we'll make on the state of the people of African descent in Guyana. The human rights is intended to also look at the issue of women and gender specifically. Haiti is one of the areas they will be looking at, and we will be looking at that as well, because we have concerns about Haiti, not only in terms of what's happening in Haiti, but in terms of how the government of Guyana treats Haitians compared with how they treat Cubans and Venezuelans and all others. So we're going to be zooming in on that as well. I know from Guyana there will be a presentation on reparations, and we are going to be making it clear that the issue of reparations is not merely an issue of external reparations. See, the word reparations really means repair. And we are saying, and all that I have said so far is about repair internally. And so we're going to be emphasizing at the UN that the issue of reparations, which has been emphasized on now in this new decade, is not just about Britain and Netherlands and France giving reparations. It's about how do you repair the systems internally so that the people can get to a point where there's equalization, and so there's need for equitable action internally as much as there's need for institutional and legal reform.
Mr. Alexander, who will form part of the team for Epatiy-G?
In this instance, the team for Epatiy-G, I will be attending for the first time. Paul Slow will be attending. Darren Wade will be attending. Our CEO will be attending. And I know that in addition to IDPADA-G, one member organization will be attending, that's ADGA. So Elton McCrae will be attending, and we're working together. So all told, on that side of things, we'll have about 4 to 5 of us in attendance.
Government will also be attending, and last year...
I am advised that the government will be attending, and that they're using, let me say the state, let me use the term the state. I think somebody from the Ministry of Youth, Sports and Culture will be going. I don't know that the person who is going has anything to do routinely with the decade here in Guyana, but somebody's going. I'm told that the Ministry of Tourism, people are going from that ministry. I don't know if the ministry has anything to do or has done anything in this country in relation to the decade, but I'm told that they are going. The ERC is also going, and we have a problem with that.
Why so?
We have a problem with that because here is a decade for the people of African descent. And the ERC sees it fitting to send someone who is not of a descendant of the people of African descent. In the circumstance where the ERC is a body that has representatives of communities, and one of the communities represented is the community of the people of African descent. There was a special process where our groups came together to identify who will represent us on the ERC. And now the ERC is going to the UN, and that rep is not going. But they're taking somebody who's not of African descent. So we have a problem with that. And we will also have a problem with what does the ERC really do in response to the decade. So,
but don't you think as a Guyanese person is sufficiently able to speak?
I must say no, for this reason. Every Guyanese could be sympathetic to the cause of the people of African descent. Every Guyanese can be empathetic. You can only have empathy if you have the experience yourself. And our representative comes from the community, has the experience, and therefore can represent us not based on observation, not based on some study, but based on his own experience in the community, in as much as he is the one who is in touch with the community for the purpose of representing the community. So we don't have a problem with other people being involved in the decade. But when it comes to a representative situation, this is a situation of representation. It's not a situation of research or study or solidarity. It's a situation of representing. And no one can represent us better than we representing ourselves.
Mr. Alexander, a lot of what was said by IDPADA-G in 2024 were rejected by the government. And I think it was the Minister of Tourism, Minister Waldron, who attended the forum on behalf of Guyana, on behalf of the state. Do you have the organization, is the organization equipped with the evidence to support its presentation come next week?
Certainly, certainly. And let me go back to the issue of rejection. Minister Waldron, like the President and everybody else, talked about the way in which the government supports reparations. And undoubtedly our government supports reparations. But there's nothing about this government that speaks specifically as a program to internal reparations. So when she said that the government embraces the African community and they embrace representations, she was not responding to our contention that internally there is no program of the government, of the ERC, that is discreetly there to address the issues of the decade. Right? I had recently an exchange with Ambassador Ramsamy, because I attended the Universal periodic review session in Geneva, and where I identified certain things. And like Minister Waldron, he came back saying that I was a liar. So I responded. I said, tell me if I'm a liar when I say that Paul Slow, who was at the time the chairman of the Police Service Commission, told this nation that President Ali told him that he should be discriminatory in the promotional exercise in the police force in favor of the people of Indian descent. Am I lying? Didn't Paul Slow say so? Has the government ever said that Paul Slow was lying? Isn't it also true that Brutus, when he approached the court, in his affidavit said that he too was given in a meeting where instructions were given that preference should be given to Indians in terms of promotion? These are things in the public domain. And they tend to say, we're lying. Am I lying when I say that the people in Mocha, their houses were not in the path of the road? I have heard people continue to say the houses were in the path of the road. Those who have eyes to see, let them see. The houses were nowhere in the path of the road. So when they say we are lying, in fact, it's a lie. But they themselves are involved in.
Mr. Alexander, earlier in your statement, you spoke about the president, reaching out to the president, even before there was a dispute. Are you hopeful that in the future, in the near future, the organization would be able to sit down, now that we've entered the second decade, sit down and have a meaningful discussion with the president and chart a way forward where we all could work together for the good of the people?
I don't know if I could use the word hopeful, given what has occurred. I don't think the president is necessarily his own master in these matters, for the simple reason that it's 4 times we've approached the president. I have approached the president personally, in person, 3 times. And in person, 3 times he has undertaken to have discussions with us. And he has not fulfilled. And it became so terrible and unbelievable that the president, in the last occasion, which was approximately a year ago, during the month of Ramadan, in the office of the president, said to me, Vincent, I'll meet you next week, and I swear in the month of Ramadan. This country is in trouble.
Mr. Alexander, closing remarks as we prepare to wrap up today's program.
Closing remarks would be that, one, Epatiy-G is about the people of African descent. Epatiy-G is not by any chance an extension of any political party. Whether you're PPP, you're PNC, or whatever you are, any person of African descent is welcome to be a part of Epatiy-G. And the things we work to have done is to impact the lives of the people of African descent at large. Epatiy-G does not accept that a handout there and a handout there and a contract here and a contract there, all of which occurs through personal contacts, through favors, addresses the issue affecting the people of African descent. We want systemic change where the people of African descent do not have to kowtow to a government to benefit from the largesse of this country. They must benefit naturally as citizens of this country who have made a significant contribution and continue to make a contribution to the development of this country.